So I always see people say stupid ass shit like, "Oh, why is Africa so poor? Why Africans can't build a civilization?" Blah 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 blah. So here go all of the answers. I'm not gonna. You can't poke a hole through this right now. Nothing you can say. This is the answer to everything. So Africa was devastated first by the Arab slave trade from the 7th all the way through the 20th century, which stole 10 to 18 million from East and Central Africa. And then by the European transatlantic slave trade from the 14th through the 1800s, which shipped 12 to 15 million from West Africa and Central Africa to North and South America, and collapsed kingdoms like Congo and Oyo, cemented in the Americas through laws like Virginia's 1662 hereditary slave law, the 1705 slave codes, and South Carolina's 1740 Negro Act that criminalized literacy, freedom, and even family bonds. And then, even after slavery, Europe deepened extraction with the 1884 Berlin Conference that partitioned Africa for gold, oil, rubber, and diamonds, while Leopold's Congo terror killed 10 to 15 million, and those systems still bleed $88 billion a year from the continent. In the United States, the same mindset produced the Dawes Act from 1887, boarding schools in 1879, and Walter Plecker's paper Genocide from 1930 to the 1970s. And repression from black codes and Jim Crow all the way to COINTELPRO. So since I keep seeing people talk about, oh, there's still slavery in Africa. Oh, there's still slavery in Africa. Let's get into why. Because they always like to leave out that reason for some reason. So if you really want to understand why slavery still exists in parts of Africa today, you have to look at the original documents Europe and the Arab world created to justify stealing African land, rewriting African history, and turning black people into a global commodity. Now, I'm getting into it. Remember, you asked for this. The papal decrees that labeled Africans as enslavable. The colonial borders that shattered nations. The whitewashing of Egypt and other African civilizations to erase black sovereignty, and the global economy built on African forced labor, all created a world where African life was treated as cheap, controllable, and endlessly profitable. Even after so-called abolition, those structures simply evolved into modern trafficking routes in Libya, racialized servitude in Sudan and Mauritania, and exploitative labor systems in the Gulf like kafala. All are rooted in the same ideology crafted in the 1400s that African bodies existed to be used. So the ongoing presence of slavery in Africa isn't an African failure. It's the afterlife of European conquest, Arab slave networks, and colonial propaganda, and centuries of extraction built on erasing Africa's true history. The world is still running off the blueprint they wrote to dominate Africa, and we're living with the consequences. You understand? So everybody always talks about the transatlantic slave trade. But the Arab slave trade lasted way longer and hit Africa way harder. Over 1,000 years of taking millions across the Sahara and Indian Ocean, building plantations from Iraq to Zanzibar, sparking the Zanj Rebellion in 869, and targeting women for concubines, while boys were often castrated for palace and household work. Ending it took a long time. The Ottomans banned it in 1857, but barely enforced it. Britain forced Zanzibar to close its slave markets in 1873. Egypt phased it out after treaties in 1877, 1884, and 1895. The Ottomans banned it again in 1889. The 1890 Brussels Act tried to stop it, but also gave Europe an excuse to colonize. And British blockades in the 1870s through the 1890s fought slave ships in the Indian Ocean. Even with the League of Nations banning slavery in 1926. It wasn't fully ended until Saudi Arabia in 1962 and the Oman in 1970. So the damage ran so deep it still shapes Africa to this day. Hey, you should probably know this stuff in this series if you're not stupid or just a plain idiot. If you ever read anything out on your own or for yourself, you should know this shit. But for some reason, they were in my comments spamming, oh, you should talk about when Africans sold black people to America. You should talk about when Africans sold their people to America. Okay, bet. Let's do it. So today we're going to be talking about the transatlantic slave trade. First, African societies in the 14 to 1800s didn't see black as a racial identity. Loyalty was tied to ethnic groups, kingdoms, or clans, not skin color. When European powers, Portugal, Spain, Britain, and France, arrived and offered guns, gold, alcohol, and land trade access to African elites in exchange for captives from rival tribes of wars. Listen. They got exchanged for captives from rival tribes of wars. Not their fucking people. They were selling other niggas. You know what I'm saying? And not even the strong people. Like the people that was like damn near clinging on for life. You know what I'm saying? They sold them niggas. Hey man, I'm not gonna lie. You should probably know the stuff in this series if you're not an idiot. But, you know, most people are. And it was in my comments spamming, oh, why don't you talk about when Africans sold their people during the slave trade? Why don't you talk about when black slaves Africans were selling their own people during the slave trade? Okay, let's do it. Part 2. African leaders were misled and coerced. Rulers were told that slaves would be servants or indentured workers, not chattel slaves stripped of humanity and bred like livestock. Others were forced into cooperation. European ships had cannons and armies. If met with resistance, people were heavily attacked. For example, Kingdom of Congo or the Queen of Ndongo, who fought the Portuguese. Yes, Africans participated in slave trades, but did not invent it. Europeans industrialized and globalized it. Africans collaborated naively or under pressure. So no, black people were not, or Africans were not just selling their people. We were tricked. And I'm not gonna lie, you should probably know this stuff in this series if you're not an idiot or like stupid, but like most people are for some reason. So I guess I gotta talk about it because there was in my comments heavy talk about, oh, well, why don't you talk about when Africans were selling black people during the slave trade? All right, let's do it. So the transatlantic slave trade is what the topic of the day is. Part 3. Blacks were in the Americas before and immediately after the slave trade. So not all black people are descendants from the slaves that came during the slave trade from Africa. For example, the Olmec heads, Arabic coins, and Egyptian-style art were all found before 1942, popularized and found by author Evan van Sertima. Moors and Muslims from Spain and northern Africa also were here before the transatlantic slave trade. And then free men from Haiti, the Caribbean or Latin America, and African sailors and traders or laborers in places like Louisiana or South Carolina came immediately after. So it's like some came through the slave trade, some came from these other ways I just named. But the other ways are usually not talked about because everybody wants you to think that you're a slave. You're a descendant from a slave. You're a descendant from this. You're a descendant from that. Which most are, but a lot came from other places, and some was already in the Americas. For example, the ones that I named. You should know this if you're not an idiot, but most people are. So I guess we gotta talk about it because they was in my comments crazy talking about, why don't you talk about when black Africans or Africans were selling black people to America? Why don't you talk about when Africans owned slaves in America? Okay, let's do it. This is part 4. Let's get straight to it. Mind you, we're going all the way back to the 13, 14, 1500s, but we ain't going in order. So you're going to catch the swag. This is part 4 too, by the way, but this is probably the last part. Then we're moving on to the next series. Let's get it going. Not every plantation was owned by whites. While true, this is complex. Like, for example, some free blacks in the South owned land and slaves. Example, William Ellison, a formerly enslaved man, became a cotton gin worker and plantation owner and enslaved 60-plus bodies. These cases are complex because people were buying family to protect them, but some did adopt brutal practices like whites. This doesn't disprove systemic oppression or racism. They highlight how power can corrupt even amongst the oppressed. Listen, so since immigrants like to come to America and act like they aren't racist, I'm going to be giving you all the reasons they are and why they are. You understand? So listen, this is part 5. Let's get into it. Also, immigration policies often favor highly educated, middle-class Africans, which creates a class divide. So, some African immigrants look down on working-class Black Americans, thinking they're superior or thinking that the working class is ungrateful or not trying hard enough. So the discrimination, listen to this. So the discrimination by Africans towards Black Americans is real, but rooted in colonialism and misinformation. Many African immigrants come to the U.S. with negative stereotypes about Black Americans, often taught in school or media that blacks are lazy, criminals, and uneducated. Imagine that. They teaching that shit in school. You know that brainwashing run deep. And uneducated. Colonial lies are spread globally. They also see blacks as not African enough and uncultured. White supremacy told Africans they were better than New World blacks and told Black Americans they were rootless. Neither is true. But we're seeing new unity through dialogue between Africans and African Americans through thinkers like your boy, Doobie. Did you know that Europe is directly to blame for Africa's under-civilization? I know. Your racism made you think that Africans was just inferior. Well, that's not true. Check it out, shorty. Let me put you on game. So on today's episode of Black History Facts with Doobie Divine, we will be discussing why people often point to Africa's underdeveloped while ignoring that European colonization, resource theft, and ongoing exploitation created those conditions by extracting gold, diamonds, oil, rare earth minerals, and even priceless cultural artifacts and even people. Africa provides much of the world's essential resources, including cobalt for electronics, uranium for energy, and agricultural goods that sustain global industries. Yet, centuries of colonization, rigged trade systems, and foreign interference have kept many nations economically dependent. Rather than being naturally inferior, Africa's vast potential was deliberately suppressed with ancient innovations like the pyramids, once believed to be advanced power and engineering hubs, undermined and exploited in the name of European research and conquest. You did. So I seen some dumbass on one of my posts say, "Oh, Africa's problems are all their own fault," right? With that logic, I guess nobody should ever go to jail for scamming, stealing, or breaking the law ever again, because apparently it's always only the victim's fault, right? But now, let's get into the facts, my nigga, because Europeans only pulled off colonization and the slave trade because Asia handed them the tools first. The Mongol Empire in 1206 through 1368 spread gunpowder and advanced metallurgy across the Silk Road, which Europe weaponized by the 15th century through systems like the Asiento de Negros in 1518 that legalized mass African enslavement, and later the Navigation Acts in 1651 through 1660s. While the Berlin Conference was in 1884, carved up Africa enforced with hut taxes. Hey, when I was typing this up and I was learning and putting all this information together, it was super funny to me because it was like Europeans use Africans living in huts as some form of insult, right? But racism runs so goddamn deep that you white motherfuckers was so poor that you had to put a tax on people living in huts in order to get further than them. You get what I'm saying? Like, you had to forcibly take money from them, people living in huts, in order to advance. Now, let's get back into the facts. Through forced labor codes and genocidal regimes like the King Leopold's Congo Free State in 1885 through 1908, where millions died for rubber, China and Japan later copied this playbook. China with aid diplomacy projects like the Tanzania-Zambia Railway in 1968 through 1975, and today's Belt and Road Initiative started in 2013 and is still happening actively to this day, that left Africa owing over $150+ billion in debt annually, tied to joint venture laws and exclusive oil mining contracts in places like Angola and the Congo, and Japan with the Tokyo International Conference on African Development since 1993 that trades loans for access. So whether under European guns or Asian contracts, Africa has been systemically locked into dependency while its wealth keeps being extracted or flowing out. So since I'm still seeing idiotic white people like spread this myth that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, let me tell you the truth. And I'm going to talk about Mexico too. The liberation of enslaved black people in the Americas was largely the result of their own relentless resistance, revolts, and self-emancipation, rather than benevolent decrees from leaders like Abraham Lincoln, who only issued the Emancipation Proclamation under political pressure and with strategic limitations, leaving many enslaved people still in bondage. Now, let's get into Mexico, since Mexicans often want you to believe this. Oh, if you came to Mexico, you were free. We loved you. We stayed together with you guys. No, they didn't. Let's get into it. Now, in Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, a mixed Afro-Indigenous revolutionary who abolished slavery in 1829, was later assassinated and posthumously labeled a traitor for his actions. You understand? Then Mexico went on to even temporarily reinstate slavery in most regions. Under conservative backlash, these struggles highlight that freedom was wrested through the courage, organization, and defiance of enslaved communities. You understand? Themselves, black people fought for the freedom of black people. That's it. That's all. Not granted as a gift by white or foreign leaders. Don't let them hit you with that, oh, who was on the front lines of them wars? Which y'all? Nobody. Just us. That was kind of the whole point. So since I keep seeing dumbass white people say stupid ass shit like, oh, did you know a black man was the first American slave owner? Oh, do you know about Anthony Johnson? We go debunk that dumbass shit real quick, because I'm sick and tired of hearing it. Phone on grad. Now, listen up. Let me teach you. So the claim that Anthony Johnson, a free black man, was the first American slave owner is a distortion used to downplay white responsibility for slavery. The real roots of American chattel slavery began in 1619, when white colonists in Virginia purchased the first group of enslaved Africans from a Portuguese ship. And in 1640, when a white planter named Hugh Gwynn successfully petitioned the Virginia courts to sentence a black man named John Punch to lifetime servitude after he tried to escape, establishing the first legal precedent for slavery in the colonies. But in 1655, Johnson did sue to keep an indentured servant named John Kaser, and he won. But this was an anomaly, not the beginning of slavery. Over the next decades, Virginia and other colonies codified race-based enslavement. The 1662 law declaring that children shall inherit the condition of the mother locked generations of black families into bondage. And the 1705 Virginia slave codes made Africans and their descendants permanent property, stripping them of all legal rights. And later there were laws like the Fugitive Slave Acts in 1793 and 1850 expanded white control by forcing free states to return escaped enslaved people, proving that slavery was built, maintained, and enforced by white colonists and the government. While it is true that by 1830 there were about 3,700 black slaveholders, owning exactly 12,000 enslaved people, this represented a fraction of the system, one overwhelmingly created, enforced, and profited from by white individuals and institutions. The Johnson myth survives because it shifts blame away from centuries of deliberate white policy, but the record is clear. Slavery in America was founded through white law, white courts, and white profit. So since I keep seeing different European countries act like they didn't participate in slavery, let's get into the truth, because I'm tired of that stupid ass shit. Fun on good. So from the 14 through the 1800s, every single major European empire, including Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and the Italian city-states, actively built wealth through African chattel slavery, or indigenous enslavement, or slave trading networks across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. These powers operated slave forts in West and Central Africa, transported millions of Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas, and ran sugar, coffee, cotton, gold, and silver economies entirely dependent on forced labor. Even Even nations without large colonial empires, such as German states, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and Scandinavian kingdoms, engaged in enslaving Africans and indigenous people. You understand? Eastern Europeans or serf populations whose conditions legally mirrored slavery across 5 centuries. Slavery was not a side activity. You did? But a core engine of European wealth, state development, and global dominance. You understand? Alright, so check it out, shorty, because I keep seeing people try to like debunk history by saying white people didn't start slavery, and they even try to use black faces to spread this bullshit, because honestly, who gives a fuck? Why does it matter? Who cares? Because in the Americas, they industrialized it into the most inhumane, torturous system imaginable. One that not even African slave systems practice, since those didn't erase entire people's lineages and histories. In the United States, it wasn't just forced labor. They deliberately used buck breaking, sold off families, banned reading and writing, stripped names, languages, and religions. And from 1662's Virginia hereditary slave law to 1705's Virginia slave codes to 1790's Neutralization Act to 1856's Indian Appropriation Act to the 1879's boarding school policy, to 1930 census racial reclassification, and the 1950 to 1970 paper genocide, they systemically erased the identities of black Native Americans. After slavery, that same oppressive mindset continued through black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, sundown towns, lynching by mobs and the police, COINTELPRO, assassination of leaders, redlining, FHA loans, denials, GI Bill exclusions, destruction of over 60 black towns, including New Orleans, Louisiana, the crack epidemic, mass incarceration, school segregation, and land theft from black farmers, media demonization, and the nonstop refusal to grant reparations, proving the system never ended, it just kept evolving. You understand? Did you know during slavery about 30 to 40% of slave owners were Jewish? Oh, you didn't? Better check it out, shorty. Let me put you on game. So on today's episode of Black History Facts with Doobie Divine, we will be indulging in how the fuck did 30 to 40% of Jewish people claim slaves back in the day. Let's get into it. About 25 to 30% of white southern households officially owned enslaved people, with most owning fewer than 10 and large plantation owners making up less than the 1% of enslavers. These figures are based on census records that only accounted for legally enslaved people, not accounting for the Africans smuggled in illegally after the 1808 importation ban, or the many free black individuals kidnapped and forced into bondage, meaning the real numbers were astronomically higher. But slavery still remained concentrated in the hands of the wealthy elites, while benefiting the entire white social order. Even Minister Farrakhan has said of that 25 to 30% we mentioned earlier, 30 to 40% of slave owners were Jewish. Like, this is public record. You can look it up and confirm it, because I know y'all be quick to try to call me a liar without doing any research. Fun, I'm great. Did you know white people didn't want black people reading and writing because they were erasing our history? Because many enslaved Africans in the Americas arrived as multilingual Arabic literate Muslim scholars, writing their own autobiographies, religious texts, and legal treaties in Arabic script, demonstrating deep education and culture prior to capture. Figures like Omar Ibn Said and Bilal Muhammad revealed that literacy and Islam were tools of resistance that empowered communities, inspired leadership, and refined self-identity long before emancipation. Yeah. Go. Okay, don't forgive or don't forget, bitch, I'ma hold a grudge.